you very much. Very grateful you came out today. Let me start off with this. Lord, dear Lord above, God Almighty, God of love, please look down and see my people. I believe that God put sun and moon up in the sky. I don't mind the gray skies, 'cause they're just clouds passing by. Those are the lyrics, which I sang very poorly, to a song called Come Sunday, written by the great Duke Ellington. It was from Duke Ellington's work called Black, Brown, and Beige. That's a work that he premiered in the 1940s when he performed at Carnegie Hall. He was the first African-American jazz artist to perform there at Carnegie Hall. And he actually began a series of concerts there every year, annual series of concerts there at Carnegie Hall. But he did a work called Black, Brown, and Beige. That's what that's from, which for that time was highly unusual to find an African-American artist who would do a work that was so strongly identifying with African-American culture. For one thing, record companies wouldn't be happy with most African-American artists recording music that sounded like that. Most artists would have been reluctant to do something like that because some of the public wouldn't be receptive to them performing something that was so strongly in support of African American culture. But as I said, so he did that in the 1940s. This being African American History Month, it's interesting to note that on February the 12th, 1958, he recorded that same song again. This time, he used the woman to sing that song, who has sometimes been called the world's greatest gospel singer, and that would be the vocalist Mahalia Jackson. She sang that song with Duke when he recorded it again on February 12, 1958. When you look at the lyrics that I sang and the rest of the lyrics for that song, you know, some might say, oh, it's part of Black, Brown, and Beige, so this is some sort of pro-African-American song. But from what I hear, that song has now been included in hymnals. And so I think it takes on a much more, a wider appeal. It takes on perhaps a universal appeal even now. Those are lyrics that anyone who's involved in the struggle in the Middle East could stand up and sing. Anyone who's struggling in Sudan could stand up and sing. Anyone in the barrios or the ghettos or the poor areas of the United States could probably stand up and sing that song. Anyone who's from the wealthier communities in the United States or elsewhere could probably sing those same lyrics. So that I think that's why it takes on a more universal appeal than what we might first think of that song having. Some of the spirituals that the African Americans sang also had that same kind of universal message and that universal appeal. They sort of reached out to other people. There was a popular spiritual that, you know, and spirituals are different than gospel music. Gospel music is religious music from the 20th century, starting in the 20th century, just about the dawn of the 20th century. Spirituals were the religious music sung by the slaves. So it's very different music. Now you do hear some spirituals sang in gospel style, but they are really two different kinds of music. There's one of those old spirituals where they talk about, didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel? Well, why not deliver everyone? Again, a much more universal message. He's not just asking that, well, why not deliver us? Why not deliver black folks? The question is being asked, why not deliver everyone? It becomes a much more universal kind of message. The song continues, he delivered Daniel from the lion's den, and Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace. Why not everyone? When we think of the African American struggle for justice and equality, many of us think of Martin Luther King. Well, Martin Luther King is often classified as a fighter, a worker for civil rights. There's another important figure who came up in the 60s, and that, of course, was Malcolm X. Malcolm X was not known for his fight for civil rights. Malcolm X pushed for human rights. You know, as Malcolm would explain it, Martin Luther King was interested in making sure that the lunch counter was open, that housing was open, those kinds of things. Whereas Malcolm X was interested in saying, we are human beings. We should be respected as human beings and have our rights as human beings upheld. We shouldn't have to fight for basic rights as a human being. Again, that's a very universal kind of struggle. Malcolm X wanted to take the fight to the UN. He thought that the battleground should be in the UN, that the African Americans should go to the UN and say, this is where our struggle should be taken. We are being denied our human rights. They're not respecting us as human beings. Again, going back to this month of February, Malcolm X was assassinated on February the 21st, 1965. But he also, during the month of February, gave one of his most powerful speeches. He gave a speech called Ballots or Bullets, where he talked about that America had reached a kind of crossroads. It was time to give black folks the right to vote, or we might see an erupting society, a society where violence came the way. It was considered one of his most powerful speeches. And since I've alluded to February as African American History Month, let me also mention that there was a man by the name of Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson was born in 1875. He was the son of two ex-slaves. Remember, 1875 is just 12 years after the Emancipation was signed. It was 10 years after the 15th Amendment went into effect, which actually freed the slaves. And that's when this man, Carter G. Woodson, was born. He had a difficult time when growing up. He did manage to get some education, but he was actually 20 years old when he entered high school. Within 2 years, however, he graduated from high school with his diploma. He began teaching when he graduated from high school. Within 5 years, so 3 years after, 3 years after he graduated from high school, 5 years after he first entered high school, he became the principal of that high school that he had attended. 5 years after he entered, he was the principal of that high school. He went on to attend several colleges. Berea College is where he got his first degree. Then he went on to attend University of Chicago and got several advanced degrees at the University of Chicago. He also became a member of fraternity, the same fraternity I'm a member of, a fraternity called Omega Psi Phi, which is a national fraternity made up of predominantly African Americans. In 1912, he got a PhD in history from Harvard. He was only the second African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. The first was a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. And he would follow Du Bois in getting his PhD there from Harvard. Harvard now has an institute called the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute after a great writer. Du Bois wrote a number of wonderful books. One book he wrote called The Souls of Black Folks, since we're talking about music, also relates, just about every chapter begins with a quote from a spiritual. He quotes a spiritual and talks about that spiritual in each of the books too. But back to Carter G. Woodson. In 1915, he founded what was at one time known as the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. It's now known as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Woodson believed that education and increasing social and professional contacts among blacks and whites could reduce racism and help, and because of that, he helped promote the organized study of African American history. He believed that as long as there was contact professionally, socially, that this would help to erode racism, and he thought that there was a need for everyone to know more about African American history. Not only African American history, incidentally, he felt that that history in general should be more inclusive of the various cultures of the world, that we all should know more about each other's culture too. Everybody okay? Later on, in 1926, Carter G. Woodson was living in Washington, D.C., and he began to promote the idea of something that was called Negro History Week. And it's that idea that grew into what we now call Black History Month. But it was something that he began promoting in 1926. There are a number of interesting ties to the month of February when we talk about African American music that I could point out too. On February 7th of either 1883 or 1883 or 1887, there's some discrepancy about the year. A man by the name of U.B. Blake was born. Now, those who say that he was born in 1883 would say that he passed away at the age of 100. The other way, he only lived to be 97. But U.B. is considered one of the founding fathers of the music that became known as ragtime. He was still playing up until very near the end of his life, still a very vibrant piano player. He also made some very interesting contributions. In 1921, besides writing popular songs that became popular in music, he put a black production on Broadway called Shuffle Along, which had several very popular songs on it, and it became a big hit on Broadway. It was just revived maybe 10 years or so ago. It came back and played Broadway again in its revival, but this was a big work in the 1920s. There was a time period of about 20 years, maybe a little more than 20 years, when there were a number of productions starring and featuring black composers and black performers that were active, a part of the Broadway scene, although that only lasted for about 20 years. But at the beginning of the 20th century, there were a number of those productions, and that was one of the things that UB Blake helped to do. On February the 14th, in 1893, a man by the name of Perry Bradford was born. I know some of these names are probably names you're not familiar with. Maybe that's what Carter G. Woodson was trying to say. Some of these things we should know about, and we just don't know about them because they don't talk about them. Perry Bradford was a manager. He was a songwriter, and he was a producer. In the second decade of the 20th century, there were many who were in discussion with record companies saying that you should be recording music by African American artists, and this music just wasn't being recorded. There were a handful of things, but for the most part, it was an untapped market. What Perry Bradford did in 1920, he found out that there was a recording session scheduled with white artists, and that she wasn't going to be able to make. When he found out that that session had been vacated, he went and said, well, look, since we've got the studio time booked, why don't we bring somebody into the studio and make a recording of an African-American artist? So they did early in 1920, they did, and the session turned out to be pretty successful. Successful enough so that in August of 1920, they brought that same artist back into the studio to record again at one of Perry Bradford's songs. Her name was Mamie Smith, and the song that she recorded was called Crazy Blues, and it sold, within a month, it sold 60,000 copies in Harlem. The record companies were astonished at how much sales happened with this recording. And what happened after that, record companies opened up a division that they called their race records division. They began to say, wow, there's a market to sell music to black folks. And so they all started a race records division. Most of the major record companies had a division that was set up to market music towards black artists. But it came about through the efforts of Perry Bradford and the vocal work of Mamie Smith, recording this song called Crazy Blues. You can still hear it's an interesting song to hear, but this launched this idea of, as I said, race records. That term race records, incidentally, stayed in effect until the late 1940s, when Billboard magazine, the trade publication, finally decided to stop using that term race records, and they switched to another term to use to market music that was being made for black audiences. They started calling the music rhythm and blues. This is where it came from. It came out of this idea of race records too. In February, on February 12th of 1900, something else significant happened. Down in Jacksonville, Florida, there was a program being held on Abraham Lincoln's Day at a public school there, and 500 students there were asked to recite a poem. The poem was written by James Weldon Johnson. The poem was later James Weldon Johnson's brother, J. Rosamond Johnson, who attended New England Conservatory, put music to the poem, and that poem became known as the Black National Anthem. At that time it was known as the Negro National Anthem. Again, the words, lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise, high as the listening skies. Let it resound, loud as the rolling sea. And it goes on, sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the day that hope unborn had died. Yet, with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place on which our Father sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered, out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last where the white gleam of our star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who has brought us thus far on the way, thou who has by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. Again, to me, that's a song that's called the Black National Anthem or the Negro National Anthem. But again, it's a song that has a kind of a universal kind of message to it. This could be sung by anyone. Those lyrics could be fitting in the mouth of anyone, in the songbook of anyone, as a matter of fact. I'm just picking out some significant events that happened in February. Another event happened February 18th, 1903. A production called In the Homie opened up on Broadway. This was the first full-length production by an African-American, starring an African-American cast, that opened up on Broadway, even before Shuffle Along. It was written, produced, and performed by blacks at a major Broadway theater. That had not happened before. It starred a team known as Williams and Walker. Burt Williams was perhaps the most famous African-American entertainer of the early 20th century. He started off on a kind of vaudeville stage and then began to appear by the end of his career even with what they called Ziegfeld Follies. He was a major player in the Ziegfeld Follies. That show, incidentally, was produced by McVon Herdig and Harry Seaman. This was in 1903. By 1915, they had their own theater in Harlem where they put on a number of, I think it was burlesque and vaudeville shows. About 20 years later, they decided to sell that theater. You probably know of that theater nowadays. It has a different name now. It's known as the Apollo Theater. That was the theater that they owned. Also, in that, the music for that was written by Will Marion Cook, and the lyrics were written by a well-known black poet by the name of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Will Marion Cook had an interesting career. As a teenager, he attended Oberlin in Ohio as a teenager, and they thought that his community thought he had so much musical potential, they actually sent him to Berlin to study. He did study, I think, 2 years there in Berlin. He came back and came to New York and studied at the National Conservatory with Anton Dvorak, who, among other things, wrote the New World Symphony. And they had an interesting relationship while he was there. Will Marion Cook also is an interesting story told about Will Marion Cook. He was a violinist early on in his career, and he had a concert once, and someone wrote a review of his concert, and after he read the review, he went to the reviewer's office, and he said, "Did you write in your review that I'm the world's greatest Negro violinist?" And the reviewer said, "Yes, I did. I said you're the world's greatest Negro violinist." The story goes that Will Marion Cook took out his violin and smashed it on the table and said, "I'm not the world's greatest Negro violinist. I'm the world's greatest violinist." And Will Marion Cook also was a good friend of Duke Ellington's, and there are stories told that Duke and Will Marion Cook would ride around New York City in the cab just to talk about music. Said that Duke would, a number of occasions, would just get together with Will Marion Cook. Will Marion Cook urged Duke to study more, but knew that Duke wasn't. He even said that in one of his quotes. "I know you're not going to study anymore, so you just work on, continue the music you feel comfortable making, and go ahead and make that music." So he's a big inspiration to someone as great as Duke Ellington too. Also in February, on February 16th, 1923, the great Bessie Smith went into the studio and recorded her very first record. It was a record called Downhearted Blues. Again, it became a very popular record. It turned out to sell very well, in particular in the African American community. The blues in its early days was not a music that found much popularity outside of the African American community, and in fact, it didn't find much popularity at first out of the South, and even more so, didn't find much popularity outside or with how would we say, quote, respectable African Americans. They didn't want anything to do with the blues. The blues was considered, as I was saying a few minutes ago when we were eating lunch, it was considered the devil's music. And respectable people just didn't want anything to do with this sort of devil's music. There was a big debate that was going on in the African American community among the so-called talented tenth, or the leadership among African Americans. Some were saying, well, you know, African Americans should leave behind this jazz stuff. They should leave behind this blues stuff. If you want to get respect as a musician, you should leave that stuff alone, and you should show that you can play Beethoven, that you can play Mozart. You should show that you are able to play the music of the European masters, and you should play the music that comes from or is inspired by the European masters. But there were others who were arguing against that idea and saying, no, we have a great body of music, we have this great musical tradition, and we should go back to that tradition and use that tradition to create a music. As I mentioned, Will Marion Cook went to the National Conservatory. He studied with Anton Dvorak, who was from what they called at that time Bohemia. And Anton Dvorak was a big advocate of an idea that they called nationalism in music. He said, in general, he said that every country has their own folk music. And he said they should use that folk music to be the basis of their classical compositions. More specifically, he said, in the United States, Native Americans and African Americans have a great music. That music should be the basis for classical compositions here in the United States. Another February event, on February 16th, 1926, Louis Armstrong went into the studio, and I'd like to point out that his name is Louis and not Louis. Louis would mean he was French or Creole. He was not French or Creole. His name was Louis Armstrong. That's what he liked to be called, was Louis and not But on February 26, 1926, he recorded a song called Heebie-Jeebies. That song contains what is said to have been the first scat vocals recorded in jazz. You know what scat vocals are? Sha-ba-ba-doo-doo-doo-doo-da, sha-ba-ba-doo-doo-doo-da, sha-ba-dum-doo-ba-doo-doo-da, you know, that's just a singing of syllables to the music. So he was said to have recorded the first scat vocal. The story goes that he told, and most people think it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, was that he dropped his sheet music. And so, since he didn't know the words, he just started going, sha-ba-ba-doo-doo-doo. I don't think anybody believes that, but that's the story that he told. But something else that he did right around at that same time, he started making recordings with a group that would become known as the Hot Fives. This was a studio group. They didn't work in clubs. These Hot Fives changed the sound of jazz. Mostly up until that time, jazz had used an approach that we call collective improvisation, where the musicians in the front line, we'll call it front line, trombone, trumpet, or cornet actually, and clarinet all played a role. The cornet usually played the main melody. The clarinet usually did a slight embellishment of that melody a little bit higher, and the trombone did another sort of embellishment of that melody a little lower. With the coming of Armstrong, what we begin to see is that the emphasis switched to soloists. The music begins to emphasize soloists much more. Armstrong was had such a talented musician that he was able to solo. That was something that you didn't find much of in jazz before. In fact, even for a few years, many of those early solos were not totally improvised solos. Many of those solos may have been worked out at some point and improvised at some point, but many of those musicians would go back and play the same solo again and again afterwards. Lewis was a musician who was gifted and talented enough so that he could improvise solos every time he played. We'll skip down to a few other things that I wanted to mention too. On February the 7th, 1958, the great Sonny Rollins, who is still alive, still with us, and still an extremely energetic musician, if you get to see him, recorded a magnificent work that he called the Freedom Suite. Again, obviously, it was a work that meant to celebrate the ideas that were going on with the civil rights movement at that particular time. Max Roach, just a few years later, February 15th, 1962, recorded a work called It's Time. Again, these works are celebrating the fact of African Americans and their demands for a better place, a better recognition in the society too. Just the other day, we observed the anniversary of another event. On February the 12th, 1964, Miles Davis played at Philharmonic Hall. Again, at that particular time, this wasn't a place where jazz musicians generally played. It certainly wasn't a place where African American musicians generally played. But he played a concert that was a benefit for voter registration. The proceeds from the concert went to what was known as CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the NAACP to help out in their work of voter registration. 2 albums came out of that recording. One contains Miles' very famous version of a tune called My Funny Valentine. But there are 2 albums that were released from that. So, as I said, this month was set up by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1926. And the idea he had in mind, I saw somebody tweet the other day, a musician by the name of Jaleel Shaw, and he was saying, you know, I just don't understand this Black History Month Day. Shouldn't Black History Month be, or Black history be incorporated in the regular curriculum? Well, the answer to that is yes, it should be. But the problem is that in a lot of ways it's not, just like it wasn't when Carter G. Woodson got the idea to start this observance. And so until the curriculum becomes more inclusive of some of the many cultures that have contributed to African American life, until when we take world culture or world history courses, we begin to learn more about the cultures that have contributed to world history and the growth of civilization. There will probably still be a need for special observances like an African American History Month. Yes, we hope that there'll come a time when we'll say, remember when we used to do that Black history stuff? We hope that there'll come a time when we'll be able to say that it will be a part of American history. We hope that when we study world history, it'll be a time that is inclusive of the contributions that have come from all over the world. But I don't think we're at that stage yet. And so until we do, we have to supplement those things. I teach a class at Northeastern called the African American Experience Through Music. Now, it's just surprising to me how little the students know, not only just about music, but even about the events that surrounded, were happening in American life. For example, it always surprises me to find out that most students don't know the most popular form of theater, the most popular form of music in the 19th century in America for decades was minstrel music. And what was minstrel music? Minstrel music was the wearing of blackface by white men who were mocking and degrading African Americans. They would sing songs that they were said to have been copied from African Americans, but most witnesses say that if you ever heard the real thing, and if you heard the minstrel songs, you'd know they really were nothing like it. I played some recreations of some of those songs in class, and most of the students just said, well, this doesn't sound anything like what I think of African American music sounds like. But that was the most popular form of music in the 19th century, and I think most Americans have no idea that that's what was going on for decades. And if you said to most people outside of the United States, American theater, that would be what they thought of would be the minstrel show. That would be what most people thought of as American theater in the 19th century. So we've got a ways to go in establishing that. We still have work to do. Certainly we've come a long ways. Certainly King's dream of being able to sit at a lunch counter, King's dream of being able to buy a home. There's certainly greater employment than there was when King was around. But there's still some other things that still have yet to be achieved. I'm going to wrap this up with, and I know there's at least one person who's heard me here who has heard me read this before, but it's such a beautiful statement that I'm going to read this again. This was something that is from the 1964 Berlin Jazz Festival. God has wrought many things out of oppression. He has endowed his creatures with the capacity to create, and from this capacity has flowed the sweet songs of sorrow and joy that have allowed man to cope with his environment in many different situations. Jazz speaks for life. The blues tells the story of life's difficulties. And if you think for a moment, you will realize that they take the harshest realities of life and put them into music, only to come out with some new hope or a sense of triumph. This is triumphant music. Modern jazz has continued in this tradition, singing the songs of a more complicated urban existence. When life itself offers no order and meaning, the musician creates an order and meaning from the sounds of the earth which flow through his instrument. It is no wonder that so much of the search for identity among American Negroes was championed by jazz musicians. Long before the modern essayists and scholars wrote of racial identity as a problem for a multiracial world, musicians were returning to their roots to affirm that which was stirring within their souls. Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from the music. It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It has calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. And now, jazz is exported to the world, for in a particular struggle of the Negro in America, there is something akin to the universal struggle of modern man. Everybody has the blues. Everybody longs for meaning. Everybody needs to clap hands and be happy. Everybody longs for faith. In music, especially this broad category called jazz, there is a stepping stone towards all of these. As I said, that's from the 1964 Berlin Jazz Festival. Those are the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Or should I just... Anyone have a question?
I have a question about the geography of prominent musicians. You mentioned Harlem a couple of times. Was it mostly the East Coast or South American, southern states in which maybe there were more of that?
No, what happened at the beginning of the 19th century, going back even a little further, with emancipation in 1863, we entered the period that was known as Reconstruction. And the Union sent down troops into the South. And so there were a lot of, for the next 15 years, there were even black politicians, black governors, black mayors. They set up what was known as the Freedmen Bureau. There were hospitals established to deal with black folks. The schools that we sometimes call historically black colleges and universities were established, like Fisk University, Howard University. They were established during that time. So it was a time of a lot of progress. But in 1878, in fact, it had a deal that had, I can't remember which president it was, but in a deal to settle a stalemate, the president agreed to have the troops removed from the South. And so the Union Army was withdrawn, and basically Reconstruction ended when that happened. At the same time, we saw the growth of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and other night riders like that who were terrorizing folks. Even education had been a problem even right after slavery, even during Reconstruction. There were people who were harassing students, people who were harassing teachers. There were buildings that were used for education that were burned down. Fisk, in fact, built a building because of the fundraising efforts of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, and they built it to be fortress-like, so that those who were opposed to education couldn't come along and burn the building down. They wanted it to be able to withstand those kinds of things. But the lynchings also were at an extremely high level. A lot of blacks who came out of slavery ended up in a system known as sharecropping. And in the sharecropping system, many of them ended up in debt. You would rent the land from a landowner, and generally, in many cases, he owned the store where you'd buy the seed from, he owned the land where you buy your blankets from, he owned the land where you buy your food from. And at the end of the year, they would do an accounting, and the owner would say, well, you owe me such and such amount of money, you can't go anywhere. So they would find themselves stuck on the land. So this sharecropping was also a problem. W.C. Handy has a great blues tune called Joe Turner's Come and Gone. And Joe Turner tells the story of that song. It's a simple line. They tell me Joe Turner's come and gone. They tell me Joe Turner's come and gone. Tell me Joe Turner's come and gone. Simple line. The story that W.C. Handy said was that when they had a work project to be done in the South, in many cases, what they would do is just go round up men, whether they were guilty of something, maybe or maybe not was the case. And even if they were guilty of something, perhaps the punishment didn't necessarily fit the crime. But they had a job that needed to be done. We need to build this bridge. We need to build this road. We need to do such and such a thing. So we need 50 men to work for a month. How do we do it? We just go arrest men, and we put them on this job. So that song came about because a woman might be looking for a man. You know, she might be going around asking, well, have you seen my man Joe, or John, or whatever his name was? And a friend might tell her, they tell me Joe Turner's come and gone. He was the sheriff. He came and got your man and took him off to jail. And so that's where that song comes from. So there were these kinds of things that were facing black folks, and many of them, if they were able to, began to migrate to the north. Because to many of them, although they sang about Canaan when they were slaves, after emancipation came, they started seeing the north as some sort of heaven or some sort of Canaan land, and they wanted to go north. With the coming of World War I, many white men were at war. They were fighting the war. So a lot of the jobs in the north were open. They certainly weren't going to hire women to do those jobs. So there were, to get other men, they began to hire black men to do those jobs. And some factories, as a matter of fact, would transport black men to the north for free in like a cattle car. You know, not on a train, but not on a train where you sit down. It's, you know, a big empty sort of freight car, and you could get free passage to the north so that you could go ahead and work in the north. So there certainly were more opportunities in the north than there were in the south. So that's why many of them came to the north, because they did view the north as being a better place to be than in the south. The south certainly had all of those things that I talked about before, and many of those kinds of overt things weren't a problem in the north. Yes?
I have, thank you very much for your talk. I have kind of an overall philosophical question. When you said that there is still work to be done when the day comes that you don't have to have a Black History Month maybe, and I want to know from your personal perspective, is that work, should that work be the work of blacks only, or is that the work of blacks and whites and Americans?
I don't think it would succeed if it's just the work of blacks. You know, I think if we're going to say that this is our history, then I think all of us should do it. You know, I think, you know, black folks are only, wherever we live, we just live there. There's a lot of America where there are no black folks that live there. That history needs to be inclusive, and it needs to be taught in those places also. So that certainly, I think whites needs to know it, and they need to be able to teach it too. And I don't mean just black
and has
history.
that changed since, Goodwin, was it, the person who started? Has
Oh,
that changed, the
George
fact, yeah, how has that changed
Oh,
historically?
it's certainly changed. There's certainly, I think there's some people who are a lot more aware of some things than they were. I mean, I looked at the TV on this morning, and Channel 4 was talking about Elijah McCoy, the inventor who did a lot for shoes, who lived up in Lynn, and some other folks, you know. So there are certainly some people who know some things, but there's a lot of things that are still obscure that probably should be brought out, and people should be told about. But I think, and again, my point also is that I just don't think that this is just something about black folks. I think that there are a lot of people in this society whose part of the story has not been told, that needs to be told. Any other questions? No? Thank you very much.